Good morning. I'm not going to make a call. I have a stopwatch here. Hit start. I'm ever mindful that at 10:30 some of you are going to want tea or coffee, and the rest of you will want to get rid of it. I would say, however, that I was a little concerned about coming up here and be the only unreformed colonist in the room. So I want to thank Jane and Miranda for setting the stage for some thinking by those of us who grew up with the British legacy in other parts of the world. I couldn't help but start today's comments by referring back to Bob Keeler's presentation last night, which I thought was tremendous. And if you remember when he was talking, he made 3 points at the start. Number one, is there something that's preventable? Number two, have we really done everything we can to prevent it? If the answer is yes and the answer is no, then what are we to do? And I think I've heard everybody speak to the point since I got here that in many cases we've been lucky. I want to talk about something today that we haven't talked about yet, and that's what if you aren't lucky? What if you have a low probability, high consequence outcome? What do we think about that? And then how do we think about the total enterprise that you all are involved in upstream exploration and production, how that interacts with local political establishments, local cultures, and regulatory environments? Because I have to tell you, I did not think a lot about this. I have been involved in oil spill response for over 30 years from purely a response standpoint. But on the evening of the 20th of April, 2010, we had just celebrated my wife's birthday and I had gone to sleep. It was about 10:30 or 11 at night. And I was called by our command center, and they said there had been an explosion on the Deepwater oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico. At that point, it was a conflagration. We were attempting to rescue people, and we launched a massive search and rescue effort that lasted over 48 hours and covered 35,000 square miles. And unfortunately, as you all know, 11 people lost their lives. A small number in comparison to the 167 that were killed on the Piper Alpha, but any loss of life is tragic, consequential to their families, and should be unacceptable for any of us. So let's take Bob Keeler's paradigm and apply it. Was it preventable? Yes. Was industry prepared? No. Was government prepared? I led the government response. I will tell you, no. We were fixated on preventing another tanker accident after the Exxon Valdez and all of our regulatory efforts had been focused on that, while the technology had allowed drilling to move offshore, and we had separated the process of a rig standing over a well in shallow water to a wellhead operation connected by a riser pipe to a ship regulated by international safety standards and local safety standards, while we were looking at response plans for a tanker emergency. We needed technology that wasn't in the Gulf of Mexico. We had an uncontrolled wellhead, and in the absence of being able to cap the well, our challenge was to try and prevent as much oil from coming to the surface and having to be recovered by traditional mechanical means, dispersants, or in situ burning. We had to recover the oil. So we had to, from a standing start, do several things. I say we because it was a collective effort of industry, led by BP, the government, NGOs, everybody that was involved. In 87 days from the explosion on the rig, a capping stack had to be designed, tested, built, deployed, and put on the wellhead. In the meantime, in an effort to avert the amount of oil that was coming to the surface, we tried to create a catchment strategy and a production strategy to capture what ultimately we believed was between 60 and 80,000 barrels a day. The ultimate answer were floating production platforms that did not exist in the Gulf of Mexico because all the fixed rigs, the oil is recovered by pipelines there, using a subsea riser system. As I understand it, was only used at that point off the coast of Africa. To try and mobilize that equipment, and I think both Jane and Miranda indicated, due to the tyranny of distance in Australia, you don't have the density of that equipment. Well, it wasn't even part of the production process in the Gulf of Mexico. To try and mobilize that when you need it, and taking fixed floating production platforms from the North Sea and riser systems from the west coast of Africa, extraordinarily difficult in terms of logistics. And we're trying to build out a containment capture process at the same time we were drilling relief wells. At the same time, we were trying to build and produce a capping stack, which ultimately was installed 87 days later. That's too slow. That's too slow. Finally, there was a total lack of information about the condition of the wellbore, the blowout preventer, and the reservoir. And every step along the way that we took to try and control either the discharge or the recovery, we had to take into account that we did not know the condition of the wellbore and that putting any pressure on the well might ultimately damage or permanently fracture the wellbore and result in communication with the formation and ultimately to the bottom of the sea. And finally, unlike anything I'd ever been involved with before, we were dealing with a point of discharge that had no human access. Everything we knew, everything we did, everything we saw was through remotely operated vehicles transported back to the high-intensity video environment, the Hive, at the BB Command Center in Katy, Texas. And I've told people very often since then, this was closer to Apollo 13 than the Exxon Valdez in terms of having to manage systems without human eyes on scene and making that happen. So a lot of things became very, very hard, and a lot of easy things that might be done to make this easier just stood out completely, like standard interfaces between remotely operated vehicles and the ports on the Lower Marine riser package and blowout preventers. By the way, in the form of a confession, when the rig blew on the 20th of April, I did not know what a blowout preventer was. I was up in the middle of the night reading Schlumberger's oil field glossary. I had to go to school very quickly because 10 days later I had a pointer next to Robert Gibbs in the White House press office on CNN briefing the entire world what was going on in the blowout preventer. In case you're wondering how I did it, a little inside baseball here. I got on an airplane, I flew to Houston, Texas, and I called the CEO of Cameron on the way. I said, I'm going to be there in 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. You're not leaving until I can explain this entire thing on television. He said, what? That's how we did it. Rapid learning. By the way, one of the great keys to leadership in my view is to be a lifelong learner. Great leaders are great learners. And when you have to do it under pressure, and synapses have not been fired in a while, it's hard to start them up. So if you aren't doing it, at least read a book or something, folks. So let me explain a little bit about what Deepwater Horizon. Let me stop there. Anybody in the United States, if you stop and ask about the Gulf oil spill, they will call it the Deepwater Horizon explosion and oil spill. Everybody here has said Macondo. The perspective is from the Outer Continental Shelf, in this vernacular. In the United States, it's the oil rig, the actual mobile offshore drilling unit. Which brings up a very interesting point regarding regulation. Because international maritime transportation, and going back to the sinking of the Titanic and the Safety of Life at Sea Convention, we have an international regime to deal with cross-cutting issues related to the safety and navigation of vessels. I don't think I ever realized when I joined the Coast Guard that 30-some years later, that all the regulatory schemes related to the development of the Outer Continental Shelf in the United States, and it's the same with all your countries, Australia, United Kingdom, and Europe, that there become a convergence of regulatory and governance regimes related to the Outer Continental Shelf and shipping. And I've talked to a lot of smart people in this world. By the way, I'm not an engineer. I don't have, until the 20th of April, I didn't have experience in the oil and gas industry. I am experienced in oil response. But I've talked to the Secretary of the Interior of the United States. I've talked to leaders around the world. Nobody can tell me where in that riser pipe the jurisdiction changes from the outer continental shelf to a vessel. And to this day, I am still confused. And it has not been clarified by the investigations that were conducted by both the Department of Interior and the United States Coast Guard of what is the respective roles and responsibilities of the master of the vessel and the production manager for the drilling operation. Who makes the decision to drive off that rig? Who is ultimately responsible for safety? I think that is an ambiguity that exists, and I think it's an ambiguity that needs to be addressed. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, it's just the way it is, there is no UN body for the outer continental shelf. So this gets back to the discussion you all have been having about standards, interoperability. Can you take equipment and assets from different parts of the world, bring them together, put together a package, and do it quickly so it can be effective in the response? So let me talk a little bit about the regulatory regimes that were kind of in place that kind of shaped the response for the Macondo incident. And by the way, I was heartened by Miranda's comments about what makes Australia unique. And I thought that a lot of those comments, in fact, I thought we could maybe do a team in the future where you would have Australia on one slide and I would have Louisiana on the other. I tell everybody the best thing about Louisiana is that it is so close to the United States. We are a federal system of government in the United States, and our Constitution says that all powers not granted to the federal government are reserved to the states. And in a natural disaster, state and local governments have the responsibility, with the assistance of the federal government, to carry out the response, with the exception of oil and hazardous chemicals. Because there are interstate commerce issues associated with that, we have long decided legally that there is federal preemption for oil spill response. Added to that, the Macondo well was 45 miles offshore, southeast of the entrance to the Mississippi River. Outside state jurisdiction within the United States is 3 miles. So one of the things I had to deal with in this response was what I would call political cognitive dissonance. And those were governors and parish presidents in Louisiana that thought they should be running the response, wanted us to give them the resources and leave them alone. And when that didn't happen, it became a referendum on how effective the federated response was, statutorily led by the Coast Guard, requiring BP to adhere to their responsibilities in law in the United States that we call a responsible party, stemming from the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 following the grounding of the Exxon Valdez. So what I had were local politicians and governors that wanted control and wanted their priorities met first, and they would have the ability to do that in a natural disaster, being supplanted by a national incident commander who was the only one that had the legal authority to direct BP as a responsible party to take actions, and absent that compliance could actually invoke civil and criminal penalties. That relationship between the regulator and the responsible party was never clearly understood at the start. And given the exigencies associated with the response, I was never adequately able to explain, convince, cajole, or make happy most political leaders that there was a doctrine for the response embedded in the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. There was a way to move ahead. BP wasn't making the decisions on their own. There was federal oversight. And there was a way ahead. But the fact of the matter is, due to the magnitude of the incident, there was immediately a huge regret factor, not stated publicly, about who should be controlling this. And the question I got most often was, BP's calling the shots. I said, no, they're not. They have a responsibility to provide the assets, bring the contractors on site, and meet their statutory responsibilities under the supervision of the government. I don't know how many of you guys have been to the United States, but we have a beer there called Miller Lite. And it tastes great, less filling. I could never get a Miller Lite answer to anybody in government It never tasted right, and it never was less filling. And I experienced what I call the social and political nullification of the response doctrine. Clear to the White House. So while I was trying to do something that I knew how to do, that's being a federal on-scene coordinator for an oil spill, albeit a very large one, I had to simultaneously try to explain to the legal apparatus what the doctrine was. And if you talk about preparedness, exercises, and readiness, 6 weeks before the Macondo event, we did a spill of national significance drill in Portland, Maine, to simulate what would happen if we had a large event like that. Every single cabinet officer in the United States sent a surrogate. The same cabinet officers and same officials that didn't have time to listen to me explain the doctrine to them during the spill. Other than that, it wasn't hard. So I'm going to take you back to Hurricane Katrina, and I'm going to jump forward to the oil spill just to kind of make a couple of comparisons regarding leadership, risk, and regulatory systems. Okay? Hurricane Katrina came ashore on the 29th of August, 2005. 1 week later, I was asked to go down and assist Mike Brown, who was the head of the Federal Emergency Management Administration, who had been put in charge of the hurricane. In the week that preceded that, we'd had a meltdown in the Superdome, we had a meltdown at the Convention Center in New Orleans, and a general perception around the country there was a breakdown of law and order and an inability of the federal government to function in support of the state and local government. So I got there a week later, and as I flew in over New Orleans, I went, oh my God, we got the problem wrong. This is not a hurricane anymore. What we were really dealing with was the equivalent of a weapon of mass effect used on the city of New Orleans without criminality that resulted in a loss of continuity of government. In other words, they did not have the ability to apply the resources that were being sent down there for a week to any kind of mission effect or performance. And everybody was reporting back through their administrative chains. Coast Guard, urban search and rescue teams, mutual assistance resources from other states, and so forth. Had we known that the day after the hurricane came ashore and left, our response would have been much different. And I think we need to understand when you're dealing with one of these events, you need to understand, do we have the event right? And what do we need to do? In the case of the Macondo well, it took 72 to 96 hours with the turbidity on the seafloor, using ROVs, which are only eyes we had, to try and understand where the riser pipe was, where the kinks were at, how much oil was being discharged. This is kind of like a mystery that unfolded. If you can't articulate that right and you can't understand what the event is going on and talk about it with the public, what they think is there's a series of revelations that are only forced out of government and industry to the point where it starts to erode the credibility in the response. And you need to be aware of that moving forward. I got to New Orleans and we kind of steadied the ship in about 3 or 4 days. I was called to Baton Rouge to Secretary Chertoff's office, Michael Chertoff, the Secretary of Homeland Security, the following Friday, and he brought me in and he said, all right, here's the deal. Mike Brown's going to go back to Washington. You're going to take over the entire response for the Hurricane Katrina. Response and recovery. Called Mike Brown in, told him he didn't like it. We had the most uncomfortable press conference I've ever been involved in. If you go on Google and you put Chertoff, Allen, and Brown in, you're going to see me in the back in a blue uniform like... Secretary Chertoff left, Mike Brown left, I'm standing there. And I walked over to a FEMA employee. I said, how you doing? And she said, I'm not doing very well. I'm working 20 hours a day. I'm doing the best I can. The people need what I'm doing. They appreciate what I'm doing. I go back to my hotel room at night, and all I see is my leaders, my organization, vilified on television. People yelling at you when you walk by because you have a t-shirt, a shirt on that says FEMA. And so I got my aide and I said, get everybody in this building together, I want to talk to them. And I got up on a desk with a loudhailer with about 2,500 people and I said, listen, I've got to go back to New Orleans and get some things straight. I'm giving you all an order. Now, I had no legal authority to give anybody an order. But there's an old saying, you don't have sovereignty unless you can exert it. So I got on the desk and I said, listen, I want you to treat everybody you come in contact with that's been impacted by this storm as if they were a member of your own family. Your mother, your father, your brother, your sister, whatever. And I'm telling you that for two reasons. Number one, if you make a mistake, you're going to err on the side of doing too much. And by the way, at this point in the response, that's okay by me. Second, if somebody's got a problem with what you've done, you tell them there are problems with me because I told you. At that point, people started openly weeping in the room. There was a collective sigh that changed the barometric pressure in the building. Nobody had ever told these people in very simple, plain terms what the mission was. Nobody ever communicated the values on which the response was going to be based. Nobody ever gave them a way to create a shared vision on what their responsibility was. But more importantly, nobody ever told these people that somebody had their back. So fast forward 2005 to 2010. I was getting concerned because with all of the congressional oversight, the press coverage, the tyranny of the president, as I would call it, surrounding what was going on with the oil spill response, that nobody was going out to the relief wells. Development Driller 3, Development Driller 1, they were drilling relief wells. So I made a point to go out periodically and see those people. So I was on Development Driller 3, drilling the relief well, and I was walking around. I walked up to a Transocean employee and I said, "How you doing?" You know what he told me? "I'm working my butt off. I go back to my room at night and I can't turn the television on. I see my leaders vilified. I see my organization vilified. I know they need us to finish this." I said, "You're right, because I declared that this was not going to be over until we killed that well from the bottom with the relief well, regardless of the capping stack." So you know what I told him? "Get everybody on the mess deck." And I said, back in 2005, and I told him the story. What's the issue here? The issue there in 2005 and the issue in 2010 is exactly what you've been talking about a safety culture. How do they understand it down in the well bay? How do they understand it on the bridge of the Modu? How do they understand it when they're doing cold or hot work with a permit to work? How do they think their boss understands them? Is there a shared vision? Is there trust? Do they believe if they do their job and have passion and commitment that somebody will have their back? Very simple in concept. Everybody subscribed to it. It's like motherhood and apple pie, as we would say in the United States. Hard to do. Hard to live and walk to talk. Hard to make that manifest in the face of whether you're privately or publicly held, quarterly earnings, shareholder calls, balance sheet, profit and loss. It's tough. It's tough. But it is part of the intellectual capital and the value you build as firms that ultimately creates the ability of the organization to sustain itself in the long run, and it creates a more resilient organization so when these things happen, you get through them more quickly. And I equate resiliency to the human immune system. If you have a low immune system and you get sick, the consequences are far greater than if you're eating right, taking your vitamins and everything else. You are creating a more resilient organization. You're raising your immune system. You're creating a cause for action. It creates a shared vision that unifies your workforce together if you can create the ability for everybody to understand that at the same time. Now, I know in the last couple of days you've had the AKT folks here. And I really would like to have seen the Macondo presentation, because I understand there were some references to the Coast Guard. But I did have the opportunity 2 weeks ago to be down at Spade Adam near Newcastle with the leadership team from OMV, a Vienna-based oil and gas firm, you're probably aware. They had AKT folks there. And it was everybody from the leadership team, the folks that were working the CFO shop, legal team and everything else. And what they did was they had the AKT folks come in the morning and start the vignette. Then they had a conversation about what the vignette meant. Then they went out to a flange that had only been tightened by hand and not torqued correctly and provided an ignition source. An immediate demonstration of the power of the explosion and the gas jet. They went back, extended the vignette, went back, and we kept blowing bigger things up. Impactful, consequential, and at the end, sitting in the room, the actor coming through with a toolbox, not qualified to use the torquing tool, was walking across, and everybody waited to see what was going to happen, and somebody leapt up from the OMV team and said, "Don't do that." They just couldn't resist. They got it, and everybody started acting, then it became the repertoire expanded by about tenfold. The ability to try and understand and empathize with the people that you are leaning on to perform these activities and this work, and for them to understand that you understand that, is extremely important. That's the reason management by walking around is important. That's the reason asking questions. It means that going beyond checklists and exercises as something to be completed as a condition of permitting or operations, while is acceptable, is not good enough. Regulations should be considered a floor, not a ceiling. And if there's one thing I'm concerned about moving forward, is that we don't bring senior leadership into those exercises and place them in a situation where they have to understand that it's not just business continuity, it's not just crisis communications, it's not just exercising the plans, having the contractors come. It's how you integrate and manage the enterprise under that kind of stress based on values that everybody can understand. If there's a challenge moving forward in the area of response, in terms of regulation, what I would like to see is using the required exercises regulations, the processes related to the safety case, the reviews, actually involving senior management. Now, there's a time issue. I was the Commandant of the Coast Guard, 100,000 people, $10 billion budget. But there comes a time and a place where you have to demonstrate your commitment to your people so they understand metaphorically that somebody's got their back and they ought to be treating everybody out there like they're a member of their own family moving forward. So what would be helpful? I think a lot of it's already been discussed. I think an independent authority is the right way to go. I don't think there's any single silver bullet. I've testified 3 or 4 times before Congress since my retirement on the Macondo accident. I think what we need is what I would call a hybrid system. And I think it was either Jane or Miranda said, if you start picking pieces of this out because they don't seem to be relevant or they're too high cost or whatever, all of a sudden you've eroded the structure to the point where it's not consequential anymore, it's not achieving the performance you want. So there's some mixture of a safety management system, safety case, discussions of barriers. But I have to tell you, the first question I asked Cameron when I got to Houston was, what standard is the blowout preventer built to? And it was an API industry standard. The shear rams didn't work. There was incompatibility between the ROV arms and the ports. There was no way to measure pressure inside the blowout preventer, and we had no parameters to allow us to understand whether or not we had any integrity in the weld bore. So I think some type of independent evaluation of the drilling systems to ascertain, just like a qualified flight mechanic would under International Civil Aviation Organization standards or IMO, that there is a baseline level of technical performance from which we can then go and have the discussion about safety management systems and safety case. So my recommendations, discussion, I don't have any official role anymore, I'm in emeritus status, I guess, would be to start to have a conversation at the highest levels of your companies about these issues. And not only about the regulatory issues we've discussed and the leadership issues we've discussed, but what happens if you are not lucky. I know probably two of the most unlucky people in the world, Tony Hayward and Karl-Heinrich Svanberg. I got to know them personally during the Macondo event. You never know when one of these events, because of the cultural issues associated with the country where it's at, the regulatory governance issues, are going to result in you becoming radioactive in terms of political, media, and congressional interest. Very few people are raised, even with crisis communication, to be able to withstand that kind of pressure. So as part of the change management that has to occur in raising our level of safety and reducing risk, in my view, has to be the ability of leaders to understand that when something happens, you are managing not just a company, you are managing a larger enterprise in a level of complexity that involves the environment, it involves a political environment, it involves a cultural environment, and it's going to vary by what country you're operating in. I had the opportunity to have a discussion with the Minister of Emergency Situations from Kazakhstan a couple years ago. And we were talking about how a response would be mounted in the Caspian Sea. It wasn't entirely clear to me that if I was operating in Kazakhstan, what would happen if I had an event? Would there be an integrated response mounted, or would this automatically be considered a criminal offense? How do you manage that at the enterprise level in the areas where you work? I think it's consequential. I think it's worthy of discussion moving forward. I believe that we need to have a conversation with our leaders, and our leaders need to be involved in this because it is consequential to them if they become unlucky. If they become unlucky. I had to be the broker between BP and the White House on many issues because the White House was striving to be relevant in the response because they were trying to be responsive to their constituents. That is natural. We shouldn't let that upset us. It's going to happen. Every politician wants to be consequential and responsive to their constituents. But in the absence of really understanding the doctrine, and what you don't want is a crisis of confidence in the doctrine by the political leaders, because then they will feel the need to have to manage it themselves, which is what happened during Fukushima. In the absence of a regime like a responsible party, who bears the costs? Can you direct action subject to criminal or civil penalties if they're not adhered to? What you have is what we call tug war, the exciting game without any rules. And when you take a senior political leader and you make them the principal federal official or the national incident commander, then you have a double problem. Because they're going to be immediately held politically accountable for whatever the outcome is, and it's largely never going to be good. In the case of Japan, it was not. So one of the things I've always advised when I'm talking to people about this is there should always be somebody managing the response that can act in an independent capacity, independent from the companies that are involved, and frankly, independent from the partisanship of the politics that are involved, understanding that you're accountable to the government, in that case, to the people. I was asked on many occasions about who I work for, and I told everybody I work for the American people. There wasn't a Republican or a Democrat response. There wasn't a BP response. There was a response. And if you can detach yourself and take that kind of focus, I think you're going to do the right thing. When I walked into New Orleans and had my first meeting with the mayor and the governor of Louisiana, mayor of New Orleans and the governor of Louisiana, things weren't going that well. And the first thing I told both of them when I met them was, I'm not a political appointee. I don't work for FEMA, and my pension's assured. You should never hire anybody to do one of these responses, and Lord Cullen, I think, would agree. Or you should never agree to do one of these responses unless you're prepared to be fired. So you have the freedom and the autonomy of action to do the right thing. And throughout my response to Hurricane Katrina and the response to the oil spill, it was my endeavor to focus on what had to be done, irrespective of political, financial, or business concerns that might be involved. In this case, in the oil spill, it was stop the discharge, prevent as much oil from coming to the surface as possible, deal with as much oil as we could offshore through skimming, burning, and dispersants, and in the last resort, fight the battle on the shores and try and keep it out of the marshes and the wetlands. And it was really 5 or 6 different theaters of battle. The oil came to the surface for 87 days under different wind, sea, and tide conditions, so we didn't have a monolithic oil spill as we did during the Exxon Valdez. We had 100,000 patches of oil, 10 to 20, 30 miles long, sometime a half mile long. They're almost impossible to aggregate and use some of the traditional mechanical means to deal with it. We also, for the first time, used dispersants in a level never contemplated in our regulations, and we used subsea dispersants at the wellhead, both of which generated huge controversy by the environmental concerns in the United States. Having said that, I will sit here and tell you right now there was no consequential decision I made regarding dispersants, knowing what I know now, that I would have changed. All in accordance with law, all in accordance with products that were on schedule. Sometimes you have to stay the course and just take the incoming. So as we conclude here today, and you get your coffee or get rid of your coffee, I think the best I can do for you in a forum like this is to, quite frankly, in a very unvarnished fashion, speak to you about the intersection of government, the intersection of the private sector, the cultures that are involved, and the fact that they all play at the same time. And the final thing I would tell you is we will never have a large event, whether it's a crisis, a major public program, sports event, you name it, in this world, that will not involve public participation. And by public participation, I mean the following: 24-hour news cycle and media, internet and social media, whoever is standing closest to the event with a cell phone, not-for-profits, non-governmental organizations, and volunteers, and other private sector entities that may have a role in it. And the reason it's going to happen is there's no barrier to entry. You know, it used to be you went out and you did an operation, you evaluated, you knew what the performance was, and you could talk about it. Now, this environment changes politically and media-wise, so as you're actually conducting the operation, they are part of the landscape, and they actually can become part of or alter the response. I think it's particularly true in the case of the Boston bombings at the end of the marathon there, with all the media and the cell phones that are in the area there. You need to be prepared for that, and your leaders need to be prepared for it. I got to know Tony Hayward very well. I have a lot of respect for him and how he came up through the industry as an individual. But clearly, if you're not prepared to have somebody shove a camera in your face and ask you hard questions, that's a very difficult role for anybody to be in. And the same with the chairman of the board, Karl Heinrich Svanberg, and we had talked about that. When you get put under that type of pressure, you really have to understand what it is you want to do strategically with the enterprise, because at that point, everybody in the organization is defining the organization by their behavior. And if you understand that, that becomes the guiding principles, and that's the glue that brings you together. So thanks for having me here this morning. I appreciate it. And Malcolm, any closing words here?
That was superb, superb.